excited about. So without further ado, hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining us at Secular AZ today. Again, feel free to put your name in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from, why you're here. As you all know, white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to our democracy, and Secular AZ is your voice for the separation of religion and government. We are a nonprofit organization, and we act as your voice to elected officials all across the state and at every level. Next Friday, we will be speaking with Andrew Watkins, who is also a survivor of Christian nationalism and author of the best-selling Substack, How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. So she's going to go into we've heard a lot about that. She's going to go into some detail about that, so you won't want to miss that for sure. But for today, we are speaking with Tia Levings, and I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of her book called A Well-Trained Wife, My Escape from Christian Patriarchy. It's a New York Times best-selling memoir, and she writes about the realities of Christian fundamentalism, evangelical patriarchy, religious trauma, and is quoted in Salon, the Huffington Post, and Newsweek. She also appeared in the hit Amazon docuseries Shiny Happy People, another really great accounting of some of the most terrible people on the planet. If you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend it. She's based in Raleigh, North Carolina. She is mom to 4 incredible adults and likes to travel, hike, paint, and daydream. So without further ado, Tia, is there anything that I missed in your bio?
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive, and thank you so much for having me today. It's interesting timing that you're going to have somebody that's more of an expert on the future cast of Project 2025. I sometimes say that my story is the manifestation of it. So I lived a lot of those policies already. That strategy has been in place for a very long time, and my story shows you what it's like to live in a world that has Project 2025 as reality. So um, everybody that hears today should definitely tune in for the next one and see what you can do about it. Um, so yeah, I wrote A Well-Trained Wife over 10 years, and it started as my therapeutic experience. I wanted to externalize my story. Writing is a very powerful thing to do in therapy. And for that very reason is that it gets it out of your head and out of your body and onto the page. And it helps you like objectively see what happened and identify the patterns and the behaviors and the things that led you to the experiences and the choices that you made. And so I did that first, and then as I was going through it, I'm a writer anyway, so I was working with a coach, and she's like, "You have a story here. Why don't you write it out as a book?" And so I did, and it was a novel because I thought there's no way I can tell the truth of what this is. There's no way I can do this and be safe. It felt too scary, too dangerous. And I was still at the time parenting my kids actively and still dealing with security threats from their father. And then time passed and we had the 2016 election, and I realized, oh my God, the world that I ran away from and escaped so viscerally, I risked everything to run away from, is coming for my country. And at that point, I was in a place in my trauma healing where I could claim this as memoir and I could claim this as my name. And I felt like I had to because I knew that Roe was going to fall. I knew that we were going to live this oppressive life where women lost their rights. We lost contraception. We were going to lose education. We're going to lose suffrage, where there's so many things. And the reason why I knew that is because the Christian patriarchy wants to run the country the way that they run their homes. The family is their model for everything, and they believe they should have dominion of the world. So this is all part of a plan. It's been in place for very long. They're very open about it. Every Sunday they preach about it and congregate in groups. But it's all of it. Moms for Liberty, the book bans, the legislation, the Supreme Court's justices, Katie Britt's baby voice. All of this is related to what is coming and what has been, gradually getting put in place as we go. So that kind of gives you an overview of why I wrote the book, where I came from, like kind of its genesis. But I would love to dive into your questions. I spend my time educating on the abuses in Christian fundamentalism and how they're related to our headlines and entertainment and just our national conversation. So Yeah, I
Well,
would love to
I
dive
feel
in.
like okay, so I feel like it sounds to me when I read your book, it seemed almost like your mom maybe was a little bit more into the religion part than your dad, like the type of religion. It sounded like your dad was kind of leery about some of the things and maybe more questioning because you moved from Michigan because your
Mhm.
family had kind of a devastating financial change, correct?
Yeah.
And so you
Yeah.
ended up moving to the panhandle of Florida, is that right?
It was Jacksonville, Florida, over on the
Jacksonville.
East Coast. So, yeah, and it was a very traumatic move. I was 10 years old, and they had been the kind of Christians that a lot of people with a religious background will relate to. They Church was important as something that was valuable, but it wasn't going to interfere with your work. If you had things to do on Sunday, then you would do them. But if it was a holiday, or if you wanted to have like respect for faith, you would go to church. And so we were minimally involved, but my mom came from a stricter background than my dad did. My dad was lapsed Catholic, and my mom came from evangelical free, and church was very equated to a very safe social life outlet. So, excuse me, when we moved from Michigan to Florida, and we didn't have a social life, and we were traumatized, at a time when we didn't have language to call it trauma, we just weren't adjusting. She decided that we needed to go to this big church downtown, and Jacksonville, Florida had the largest mega church in the country at the time. We were on TV. It was a very large ministry outreach in the city. Like you couldn't go anywhere without seeing some reference to First Baptist. And so we went to the big mega church downtown to have a social life. It was so innocent. And I will say I had a lot of good memories there that made it very hard to unpack the bad ones later, because I did have a very mainstream evangelical, safe, protected childhood there. I was there 6 days out of 7 in some sort of church activity. And I was not aware of how I was being groomed and indoctrinated in a church that was becoming more fundamentalist and more nationalist as I grew up.
Right. And it's funny because you probably just said mega church, but it sounded like mega church. And I think nowadays kind of the two are
The same.
interchangeable,
Yes,
Yeah.
they're the same.
Well, and also, because your family was dealing with financial hardship, this is another reason why people will turn to the church, right? Because there's that kind of, we don't do a great job in this country, and especially in certain states, to provide social safety nets. So sometimes the church, and it sounded
Mhm.
like to me that was part of the appeal, maybe, was that social safety net that your family got.
Yeah, I think that's always the case, actually. I think that fundamentalism is the answer to chaotic times. And when people are looking for the security of something simple or something familiar because things feel out of control or different, or they're very confused on who to believe, they will always turn to somebody who's reassuring them with answers. And that's what fundamentalism does, whether that's in your nutrition or your fitness group or your faith. Fundamentalism is always just a really simple promise with a simple solution and a series of steps to get there. And if you follow these steps perfectly, you will have a pure ideology and a happy outcome. So I think that, yes, that happened to us, but I think that happens on the whole. And I think that's what America is experiencing right now, is that we're going through major social change. And here's this big force that says, if you just go back in time and live this way, things will be somehow different than they were the first time we lived that way. Like we know, we know that wasn't so successful, but they make it sound like, well, you just didn't do it right, and we'll do it better this time.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you already talked about the indoctrination that takes place, and you do such a great job of kind of like, it's almost like breadcrumbing. If you're familiar with abusive relationships, which you are, and
Yeah.
terms that go along with like narcissistic personality disorder, it's like they're breadcrumbing you with all of the weird promises of Christianity, and the first thing I wrote down when I was reading it comes from page 11. And you wrote, smiling children who get in line made parents and God happy. And it made me think of, oh gosh, I get them all confused because I read a lot of books, I watch a lot of documentaries, docuseries, but one of them talks about how there's this church. It may have even been Kate West, who wrote the book Rift, but
Hmm.
how all over the church it says, parents are right even when they're wrong,
Yeah.
and that's like so no matter what happens to a child, smiling children who get in line make parents and God happy. And that just struck me. And then it keeps going. Your friend whose mother died, and you of cancer, and you were like, oh shoot, wow, so God does, like, prayer isn't the answer and good people do die. Like, you,
Mhm.
the way that you write about reconciling with that, the justification, and then the thing that blew me away the most was how when the Challenger exploded, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
well, that's not what blew, a lot of things blew me away in your book, but when they said people die when scientists play God. So that was the
Yeah.
message that you were getting at an early age. What was your science instruction like in these religious schools?
But it was just reading the book of Genesis. And then we had a churchy, like a religious science book that went along with it that would then tell us how the world was wrong, how evolution is wrong, how the scientific method is wrong, how you don't need to, like, all of the research is skewed, all of the evidence is skewed, you can't trust any of it. So that we are exactly where we would land today, where people think that climate change isn't man-made, but somehow men can make up hurricanes and assault Florida with them. So, like, it's this dissonance of who's more in control. Like, I mean, I grapple a lot with this still, where I listen to them say, the Democrats stole the election, or that men are making hurricanes. And I'm like, okay, well then your God's not very strong if you can do all that. But it's the same thing that I was dealing with as a child when I realized they're telling me God's all powerful, but my friend's mom just died. And the Challenger just blew up. And somehow that what was unstoppable
Mm-hmm.
makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I also find it very interesting, and I wonder how often this is the case. You talk about how the words porn, golden
Mhm.
showers, and orgies, you learned where?
At church, at camp. I sat in so many R-rated sermons, and all of the violations that I experienced happened at church. Now, I think that bears out statistically. 90% of children who are molested by someone they know. And 40% of that is by somebody who's not in their family that they trust. So if you're spending 6 days out of 7 at church, guess who you're around? People at church. And those churches have a really bad practice of, well, how they handle abuse and how they address accountability. There virtually is none. And so it just perpetuates on and on. So yeah, golden showers, orgies. I was 11 years old. I learned those terms as a kid. My parents would never have let me watch TV that mentioned that. But I went to youth camp and heard it from my pastor.
And the impression that I got, because here you are like, okay, I'm born of sin. I'm a girl, so I'm even more of a sinner. I have to
Mhm.
constantly cover myself, but he's telling me I need to avoid these things, but I don't know what they are. It almost sounded to me like the youth pastor when you said, I don't know what these things. It's almost sounded like he got mad at you.
Mad's a word. Mad's a word. That same youth pastor really likes to have girls come into his office and explain exactly how they fornicated with a boy. He really likes the details. And mad because I maybe embarrassed him in front of his friend, but I really do think that he gets his rocks off that way. I mean, I think that is a very oft repeated story in these environments, and there's something to the power of that violation and being getting away with it that we see on the national stage today. It's the same.
Yes, the disconnect of, because okay, so like I part of the work that I do here in Arizona, and I'm also I used to be an educator. I was a teacher for many years, and I sat on a local school board for 8 years. So school boards part of our democracy, and right now we're seeing them being taken over by
Yes,
a
you
lot
are.
of these evangelical extremists. So I couldn't believe the things that I was hearing people say. I didn't grow up in a church. And I couldn't believe going to school board meetings that have typically always been just kind of routine. Occasionally, you might have a controversy. We're going to build a new building. We're going to change the name of an old building, something like that. But
Mhm.
nowadays, everything is seen as a controversy and as a way of trying to, take away people's parental rights. So I started writing about these as my own form of therapy. Like, I can't believe that this is happening. But
Mhm.
I would go and see like church sermons happening at in school board meetings, and some of the things that you talk about in the book, I'm like, I feel like actually your book kind of helps me understand these people a little bit better,
Mm.
by how you were, indoctrinated at such a young age, and these folks were too. Um, there was a question in there, and then I kind of lost
Okay.
my train of thought. But my point is, it surrounds us everywhere right now, like the kind of indoctrination. Like, why do you think these folks are getting involved in their public schools when so many of them don't even use those public schools, or they homeschool, or they use private schools, or they use
Yeah.
vouchers?
The ultimate agenda is to get rid of public education. They they're sabotaging it, they're ruining it, they're attacking it, they're breaking it down, they're weakening the entire structure because they don't want compulsory education in state schools. They want everything to be religious in nature. And again, that's where I say that you can take their family model and the way they live their lives, and you can say this is how their model is for the country. They it's very capitalistic. So if they are going to need to educate a base, the grunt workers won't need an education, and the girls and women won't need an education, and they don't want the state telling them that they have to educate. And I don't mean this as your average MAGA person who's like involved in their public school. They're it's right over their head. They're just tools. The people you have to watch out for are like Mike Johnson, Katie Britt, people like that who are educated, smart, the Heritage Foundation, all of Project 2025. They are smart, they are skilled, they are patient, and they're going to enact this entire overhaul of the country for a religious agenda. And then people will wake up and be like, oh, I didn't mean that. That's not what I wanted. But it'll be too late.
By then it'll be too late. Yeah, especially like, for many of these women, like Turning Point USA is in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Mm.
Alliance Defending Freedom is in Arizona. We've got a lot of money pouring through this state right now because it's an election year. And so these folks are laser focused. But so, like, for example, there's a Black woman who is a Turning Point USA operative, and she doesn't understand that she's in the leopards eating your face party, right? Like,
Yeah.
once they accomplish their goals of, destroying public education, subjugating women to, the kitchen,
Mhm.
whatever, Black folks doing anything in this dream society of theirs, it's just not going to happen. And so, like, watching these women who are on school boards right now, who they're going to be like Serena Joy in The Handmaid's
Mhm.
Tale. After she got everything that she wished for, she then became just a wife. Do you know what I mean? Like, she
Yeah,
didn't really have the power anymore.
and then it's done. You see this happen in church governments that are run by a small group of white men. And if they have to have a woman, she's in charge of the children's ministry. But they'll get rid of that, so there's no real power involved. It's just you're convenient while we have to have you, and then we will phase you out.
Mhm. So let's talk a little bit. You've been told at this point as a teenage girl, your only worth is finding a husband, giving birth, just doing that traditional role. So, you go through a few, couple experimental, I guess, relationships. It doesn't sound like your dad was the kind of guy, though, who had to have absolute control over every single person you met. Is that the
Yeah,
right
no,
takeaway?
yeah.
Yeah, it didn't seem.
In my story, it's a little bit unique that way, in that while it would be more convenient for me to say, "Oh, I had these oppressive parents, and they knew what was going on," they didn't. They were hardworking Midwesterners who took their kids to church and trusted, in a very Gen X way, that we would be fine. And we looked fine, for a long time. And we looked like good, safe kids that were, not in danger and not staying out late and had good friends and went on fun trips and led people to Jesus. So it seemed from a parent's point of view, really good. But my dad was a little bit, by the time I graduated, he wanted me to be able to provide for myself. And if I didn't get married, he wanted me to have an industry. Um, and he wanted I wanted to be married and have a family. So he wanted what I wanted for me, but he wasn't pushy, and he never ever would have courted me away. Like, he doesn't want to be involved in that. Not to say he doesn't have opinions on who I married, but he understood it was my decision to make.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
So you end up with your now ex-husband, Alan. Um, and before all of this, somebody at church, I believe it happened first. Somebody at church told you that there's no rape in marriage.
Yeah, she was
And
my best friend. Like, she was this is something that you see repeated in my story is the women who become complicit. And you mentioned Serena Joy, and that is a trope. That is part of this. She was in the way of moving that direction herself because she's very fundamentalist attitudes still to this day. And so she was, trying to bring me along with her. And so a lot of my inner conflict came through our conversations. That was one of them.
it started off pretty early with Alan, the abuse. And again, this is your story. And I don't, like, I know this has got to be a very difficult thing for you to talk about. So please, if any of this
Mm,
is like way too much, just let me know. And I'm not trying to be explicit or anything like that. But when, it happened pretty early on, that he, it sounds like he, what's the term they use? Love bombing, right? He started
yeah.
off really love bombing you. And then gradually with little things, he would, kind of tear you down.
Hmm.
And I'm guessing too, he found you attractive because you are a strong woman. Typically, a strong, smart, funny, accomplished woman. And
Hmm.
narcissists do tend to find people that shine because it makes
Right.
them a little bit brighter. Was that the
Right.
case with you and your ex-husband?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he knew. Obviously didn't have language for any of this that was happening. It would have been so helpful if I'd known the word what love bombing was, or what intimate partner looked like, or that I should feel compatible and have chemistry with my partner. That would have been great. Or if the church had said, don't be engaged for 2 weeks. Instead, they said there's nothing wrong with 2-week engagements. That's a great idea. Um, so, but he knew that he couldn't hold that act very long, that we needed to get married quickly so that he could relax because he was putting so much energy into performing. And he's not able to hold that up for a real long time without cracks. And so the cracks did start to show while we were engaged. But again, I had no vocabulary or knowledge for that. And so I internalized everything that happened. I thought it was my fault. I screwed up. I did something wrong. And the only answer we got from church was that we had the rest of our lives to figure it out and that we had God in our lives. And so it would eventually be fine because God would help us work those problems through.
Yeah, and it made me think too that this is something that women do even in secular society
Mhm.
too,
Yeah.
right? Like the patriarchy is everywhere. It's not just in our churches. It is absolutely everywhere. And as women, I think that oftentimes, because full disclosure, I was in an abusive relationship at one point in my life, and you make excuses. You get to see them at their best too, so you're like, that's going to come around again. You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Yes.
And it never really does, or if it does, it's fake because they got to make it up to you, and it's that cycle of abuse. And then you say too, and this is something that people in the secular world say all the time, maybe it's my job to fix him.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was
And
taught. That's what women do. They make up for the problems their men have. They smooth over the cracks. They keep the family running and smiling and humming. And that's, yeah, I totally understood that. Well, I have abilities he doesn't have, so that's why God put us together.
Mhm. Well, and your book made me think about something that I've encountered all the time, but had never really thought about it, because keep sweet, pray and obey, like, shiny, happy people, all those, you can't cut your hair. And
Mhm.
the way that I mean, you're such a good writer, Tia. I gobbled your book. I really did. It was so good. And you even made me laugh sometimes in a very serious
It's
topic.
funny. Thank you for pulling out the humor. I do have humor in there.
Yeah,
Nobody
that
ever
it
talks
was,
about it.
like in between, like, I was literally, there would be times where I'd be laughing and crying. Everybody, you need to
Mhm.
get this book. That's all I'm saying. But you made me think of it because you do write, pretty strong descriptions of
Mhm.
your accounts of abuse. And it made me think that's why they don't let women cut their hair, because it's easy for them to pull it.
Yeah.
Because pulling hair is like so common in everything that I've seen. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's why they don't want women to cut their hair, probably, you know?
It's one of those reasons. There's a lot that goes into hair and there's a lot that hair can do. So, yeah.
It's wild. Okay. And then, all right. So then, now's the time y'all are going to start having babies. I think you're still at the same church that you were raised with your
Mhm.
parents at this point. And it's a big deal in the fundamentalist community to have natural home births. And I love this part too, because in a former life, I was a certified breastfeeding counselor, and I also gave birth twice at home. And I read the book Spiritual Midwifery by Ina May Gaskin. My daughter's
Brilliant.
middle name is actually May because of
Oh,
it.
I love that.
Yeah, but because it where I worked, we worked at this we worked for an international board certified lactation consultant, and we also sold clothing and like breast pumps and things like that, bras to fit everybody. So it was this weird convergence of people like me, like the crunchy hippie granola mamas, and then
Hmm.
the LDS right wing, or like
Yes.
the mega church moms, like, because on both sides, Mother Magazine told us not to vaccinate, and their churches told us
Right.
not to vaccinate. Do you know what
There's
I
a
mean?
pipeline and an overlap. Absolutely. Yes.
It's really wild. And it's funny too, because then you also brought up Gary Ezzo.
Yeah.
Gary Ezzo, for those of you who don't know, wrote a book called Baby Wise. And it was a book. Can you just tell us a little bit about Gary Ezzo? Because I know you know more than I do.
Yeah, so Gary Ezzo's program, his pilot program was called Preparation for Parenting. And he was a member of John MacArthur's church in California, and our pastors were friends. And so our church became a pilot program test sample group. At the same time, I was pregnant, and I knew how to take care of babies. I'd already been a nanny, and I was confident in infant care. But this was like the trend in our church. Everybody was taking it. If you were pregnant, then you would definitely take the class as part of your church training on Sunday nights. And also, I needed to help get my baby to sleep because I had a violent new husband, and I was very interested in, well, how do you get them to sleep through the night? So that's what Baby Wise says to do. It puts them on this rhythm where you sleep and feed and wake, and it's very cyclical, not so much a strict schedule. But the entire thing is built on this idea that your child is a manipulative sinner who is trying to work you with his hunger cries, and that you're giving into his sin nature by feeding him when it's not time.
Yeah. So a lot of those like mega church moms that ended up working at the store where I worked
Hmm.
were there for a lactation consultation because they were reading Baby Wise, because people were giving, like, they would come in with depressed, their heads they
Yes.
were dehydrated, these babies.
Yes. Babies have died because of that program, and that man should be in prison. And that's a theme that's in a lot of these books. Like Michael Pearl should be in prison for what he teaches about blanket training, but they're still for sale on Amazon. They're still thriving ministries because those fundamentalists are very good at exploiting religious freedom for their own benefit. And when they get it, they're not going to give the rest of us religious freedom or freedom from their religion. We're not going to have that. So, yeah. Anyway, that was
We
a nerve.
we used to, like, so we all had little kids, and so we'd go to like Borders or Barnes and Noble or the library or whatever, and we would take the
Mm.
Baby Wise books and put them in the science fiction section, because we were such rebels. Um,
Yeah.
because
I always, in this point in the interview, whenever we hit that note of people who were against Baby Wise, I have to give a little shout out to some angel person who I don't know if I'll ever get to talk to them. But I was in the bookstore one night, and we were looking at the Baby Wise books, we were looking at the parenting books, and a new mom was there, or she was pregnant. I guess she wasn't a first time mom. And you know how you like stand next to somebody by the shelf and you're like kind of making contact, like little chit chat about the whatever you're looking at. And I was like, oh, that's a great book, Baby Wise. You should get it. And she picked it up and she said, this book hurts babies and I hate this book. And I didn't know what to say. I was like really stunned and kind of just stunned. And and she walked away, and that was the end of that interchange. But that little seed in my head eventually, like in almost short order, was like, wait a second, I don't have to do this. And my baby doesn't need this. I was pregnant with my second at the time. It was one of the things that helped me change my mind. So I think that for people who are like, what can we do when we meet people who are in this? Be true to yourself, speak up, say things, plant seeds. You might not see the change right away, but you never know what they're going to go home with and think through and question.
Yeah, my mom also gave me a James Dobson book too. And at
Yeah.
that point, I mean, it was with my first, and I already knew enough to know
Yeah.
I mean, I was already reading spiritual midwifery because I was having a home birth. So I was fully embracing all of that.
Mhm.
And so that I knew that I was going to do attachment parenting. I just knew
Yeah.
that I did. Um, let's see. Okay, hold on just a second. Let me get to it here. My notes should have been way, way better. So you bring up too. Okay, so you've given birth, I think at this point, your first child, if I remember correctly, was a girl?
A
I
boy.
just read it. I should know.
It's okay.
Was it a girl or a boy? I missed it. I'm
It's a
sorry.
boy. William
Okay,
was
okay.
first.
And then
Mhm.
your second was a girl, okay?
Mhm.
Because you had those two first. And I think it's at that point that your ex-husband went to Vision Forum. Is that
Mhm.
correct? Right around
Yeah,
that time?
right around
And
that time.
so can you maybe explain Vision Forum too for people who don't know what that is? Because that's another common thread through all of these books, memoirs, documentaries, etc.
Yeah, and for people who are familiar with Kate West's story, she was heavily into Vision Forum, more so than I was, because it was her father, not her husband at the time. That had a lot to do with it. So Vision Forum was Doug Phillips' ministry. Doug Phillips was this very charismatic homeschool leader. He wanted to be a movie star and couldn't, so he had that like charisma and flair, and he loved to dress up in costumes, and he loves like romanticizing the Titanic and dinosaurs and patriot type costumes. And so they had a whole line. The Vision Forum ministries had retreats, they had toys, costumes, books, tapes, and most importantly, in this world, Doug had one of the first blogs that ever happened. And so Doug's blog was a place where husbands and wives would go, mostly husbands, and read his thoughts, his pontifications on culture, and they're all the seeds of what we see today. They're all patriarchal. They're all this hyper conservatism. Um, that's why I wasn't allowed to vote, was because Doug talked about head of household voting and caught the idea. So he would also recommend books and things like if you wanted to do further study. And so a lot of authors in this world got their boost when Doug promoted their products.
And it sounds like your ex-husband just swallowed it up whole, like hook, line, and sinker. He thought he was the greatest guy since sliced bread.
If anybody's familiar with the Theo Bros today, I mean, that's what this was then. And they all had crushes on each other. They were all like, they all want, like, there's this rabid society, and they were peers. This is your cool club, for the men. And they really, all their ideas got exchanged that way. And it's not that different from any other special interests. It's just the kinds of things that they were nurturing and producing were really dangerous and harmful.
So, now remind me, because you 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 had a third child, and
Mhm.
talk about that and what that experience is like. You had two children already, a marriage that you knew already was not right, and I believe, and now he's in Vision Forum, and I think he even wanted to move you guys, but I can't remember the sequence of events. So talk about
Oh,
that a little
at
bit.
this point in the story, he wanted to go to Bible college in Columbia, South Carolina, and
Mhm.
he was wanting to be a pastor. And so he was just studying a lot. And I was pregnant with my third baby in 3 years. And we were really trying to follow our fundamentalist mentor's advice. And we were involved with Bill Gothard's IBLP at this time. And I had mentors who were teaching me how to do all these things and skip all these very ordinary practices that we should do as parents, that they don't do because it interferes with their family size. And most recently, you might have heard JD Vance say something about car seats being the reason why the birth rate is low. He's dog whistling to parents who have too many children for car seat laws, and they're really butthurt about that. They really do not want the state telling them they have to put their children in car seats, that they can expire, that you have to swap them out, that you have, might be limited by how many you fit in your car. All of those things keep them from having as many babies as they want. And so when he said that, he was saying to them, I'm going to change the regulations so that you can do your thing. So it was that kind of thing. That's the kind of environment we were in, of don't go to the doctor, don't educate your girls, women don't need to vote, you don't need to go to the gynecologist. Like there were thing after thing after thing, that helped, that we didn't do specifically so we could live on one income in poverty and have as many children as possible. And so I was trying not to have prenatal care because prenatal doctors, obstetricians, are pretty dangerous. Actually, they can spot signs of abuse. They can report you. They can recommend that your child be, that your pregnancy be terminated. They can warn you about how many babies you're having in a row. So they just would rather you don't go. And they had, at this point, they were training up their own midwives so that they don't have to deal even with a secular midwife, advising them not to have so many children close together. But I didn't feel good about it. The whole pregnancy, I was like, I think I should go to the doctor. I think I should go to the doctor. And at 32 weeks, I went into preterm labor. And I just took myself to the ER. I just was like, I'm doing this. I'm not putting my baby at risk. And they found a heart defect. So I spent the next 8 weeks on bed rest, and then she was born at term. Her name was Clara. She lived for 9 weeks, and we went to Atlanta to have heart surgery. And it was very, I think, cataclysmic experience for me. I had not ever lost anybody. I had never been away from home on my own. I was away from my children, away from Alan, away from my mentors. And I was around professional women who were doctors and nurses and social workers. I learned all kinds of empowering language through that experience. And my whole psyche split open. Like that was an experience. I could not be the same person I was after. And I went back into an environment where they expected me to become the same person that I had been and get pregnant again really quickly and just bounce back. And I couldn't do it. So I talk about Clara all the time because every time I talk about her, I open space for someone else to share their story too. And it's just impossible to tell my story of how I'm here today without that split and that canyon that she created in my life.
To be quite honest, I mean, at that point, I was actually surprised that Alan would even, allow for you to try to save her life,
Yeah.
like I was surprised that he was willing to allow that. And it seemed like during that time, he kind of, well, you were in Atlanta, so, and I believe it was your parents watching the other two kids. So,
Mm.
but still, like, the fact that he like even allowed you to try to save your
This is a
baby.
good moment though for us to remember who he is. He was a 25-year-old boy. Like I have 25-year-olds now, and I think there's no way you could put your foot down and say you can't do something. And her defect was so big, and the situation was so big that and this happens in this world where they just sweep you away. I have a friend who's they're not really friends anymore, but they were friends. Their child was badly burned, and they had to go to a children's hospital, and then it did change a lot of their lives, because when it's that like you can't argue with it, you have to go into the world and deal with this. A lot of things get confronted, but Alan was a 25-year-old boy at this time. He was not that powerful. He was that powerful over me, and I was in this surrounded, environment where all power flows through men. And so I didn't question it. I didn't know I could until Clara. Um, but yeah, I mean, really, he's not that powerful anymore. And I'm not afraid of him anymore. So I don't think of him that way.
Good, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. So during this time, let's see, let me see. I should have been more organized with my notes. Um, oh, one of the quotes that you brought up too is well, you talk about too after Vision Forum, like there was more of a crackdown on the worldly stuff, like the secular stuff. So movies weren't allowed anymore, certain books weren't allowed anymore. But like one of my favorite parts of your story too is the library and the internet were your lifelines,
Yes,
right?
they were.
And it now makes perfect sense about why they're trying to ban,
Mhm.
defund libraries, ban books, because though, you just being able to go to the library, I think saved you. Like, and
Yeah.
not only that, but all the resources for your kids. Talk a little bit about how you relied on the library during this time.
Yeah, well, so they had forbidden the library. And here's a good character arc. The scene's not in the book, but it happened. While I was pregnant with Clara, I actually attended a city council meeting in Jacksonville and rallied against putting the internet in libraries. That was before I had Clara. And then 2 years after Clara, the library is one of the first places I accessed internet because thankfully our efforts were not successful. Um, but when I hear them like banning TikTok now and they have it all cloaked in all this like commercial stuff, I'm like, that's a survivors network. That's why they want this stuff shut down. It's an education network. It gives people access where they wouldn't have access. And is it perfect? No. Like there, of course, there were things that happened in library. I was sexually assaulted in a library. I understand that there were things that happened. It's just another scene that wasn't in the book. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't fix that problem and not throw the whole thing out. Like you can't just restrict the flow of information that way in a free country. So book bans were already happening, internet bans. The thing I had on my favor was that I was savvy with it and they didn't understand it. And so I was able to use that. And as a homeschooler, the internet gave us a lot of resources that they were excited, in Doug's blog, like Vision Forum, they were trying to use the internet for their good, and they just weren't visionary enough to realize what the women might do with it. And we were networking.
I love that for the women. I really
Yeah, I do too.
do. So at what time then, and in your timeline, when did you move from Jacksonville?
In 2004, we left Jacksonville and went to Tennessee.
Right. And you lived in a really small community in Tennessee, correct?
Yeah, it was really, really small. It was outside of Knoxville. There's a bunch of little coal towns, and it was just a little town that was outside of Knoxville.
And I mean, you moved there for a specific church, I believe, because he was in his, ministry studies, correct?
Um, he at that point he never did the ministries thing. That was his Clara fallout, was that he didn't go to Bible college. And he moved. We became more reformed. We became Presbyterian. He was moving leadership at that point. So, if viewers are familiar with R.C. Sproul and R.C. Sproul Jr. and Doug Wilson, out in Idaho, who still has a huge ministry out there. I use the word ministry lightly. It's national terrorism. He That's what he was into. And we were in very, very high control teachings at this point. So I didn't know that we were moving to Tennessee for this specific congregation until we were there. And what it was a congregation of like minds, which sounded nice, homeschoolers like us. But it ended up being a group of high control patriarchal families that believed in federal marriage, which teaches that husbands are accountable to God for everything that happens in their homes, including their wives' behavior. And the way that they deal with that is through corporal punishment, to hold her in line and in check so that she's truly obedient, not just submissive.
Yeah. And so at this time, like you're really isolated. You're far away from your family who still lives in Florida. And so
Mhm.
you decided to start a blog. So talk a little bit about that decision, and how you were able to justify it.
Yeah, so it was so innocent. Blogging was enough of a familiar word because of Vision Forum that I knew it existed. Blogspot had just come out. It was brand new. And lived in Tennessee and was taking my kids around, and I wanted to update my family all at once, not just write everybody the same email over and over again. Um, so I started a blog called Living Deliberately, and it took off. I was good at it. I was a good writer, and the we didn't have algorithms back then, and it just blew up. I was good at it.
Well, and was it, I think you said, I think it's your brother-in-law that maybe helped you, like, here's how you
Yeah.
can increase traffic, here's a little basic coding for you and all that. So
Hmm.
there was a brother-in-law, man in your life who was like, I'm gonna help empower you, you
Yeah,
know?
he gave me my first domain as a Christmas present that year, and he used to spend hours on the phone teaching me the back end of computers and SEO, and how to customize sites. And eventually, within that year, I was doing it as a business, as a side industry.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty incredible. I mean, honestly, the you and I are probably, I think I'm a year or so older than you, like if I'm inferring
Mhm.
from, your timeline.
Yeah.
And so we did, I feel like we did a lot of the same things. Home birth, spiritual midwifery. We knew that Gary Ezzo was bad. all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And I would also go on the baby internet, right? Like with the AOL email address and everything, and I would access places where I could find other women who are trying to live the crunchy hippie granola lifestyle. And I guarantee I probably stumbled upon your blog
We're
at some.
probably on the same cloth diaper list or something,
We probably were, yes.
E-lists.
It's so true. Yes, it's so true. So all of this results in you, like it's, and you justified it with Alan by saying, this is so I can keep in touch with the family. I can post pictures. I can do this. I can do that. But
Mhm.
it blew up to like what, 80,000
A day.
viewers?
A
Yes.
day, yeah. I was writing book reviews at that point, and I wrote some reviews of Oprah titles, and the titles, the SEO was there, and so yeah, it blew up.
And you got recognition. So you got to
Mhm.
participate in an event, Blog Fest.
Yeah, it was a blog party,
So
the world's biggest blog party. That's what
is
it
that
was
something
called.
that still exists today?
No, it was just a brainchild of one of my clients, and it was a 48-hour charity event where we would basically stream before streaming was a thing. We were blogging all night, and we were doing interviews with charities, and we were raising money for the ones that were like a list of charities. And yeah, so I was suddenly interviewing people and running this event, and yeah, it was a little ahead of its time.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So, and I think too, at this point, you've had another child at this point,
I
correct?
had in that 14 years, I had 9 pregnancies, 5 live births, and 4 surviving children. So yeah, I'd had all 5 by that point.
Okay.
Mhm.
So this blog fest was not in your tiny town. So you had to travel, was it to Georgia, I think?
Excuse the kitty.
It's okay.
It was in Knoxville. So yeah, it was about an hour and a half away from home.
Okay. And during this, you had a medical issue, like exhaustion, correct?
I collapsed out of exhaustion. I basically didn't sleep for 2 days and lived off coffee, and adrenaline, and it caught up with me.
Okay. And so this results in another event. If you want to talk about that.
Just that they had to take me to the hospital, and that the doctor was he pretty much knew, kind of like the way people will, like there was this pattern of people who knew what they knew, but they weren't at didn't have agency to really get me out or to say what they knew. And he could tell that I was in an abusive dynamic, that I needed to sleep, that I needed to be away from my husband. And so he recommended that I stay in town with friends and sleep until I wake up. He didn't have a reason to keep me at the hospital after he hydrated me, and my heart rate came down, but he didn't want me to just go home and resume normal activities. So I did. I went to sleep at my friend's house, and when I woke up, my husband, it was about 18 hours of sleep. When I woke up, my husband had reported me missing to everyone, and my parents were frantic. My family was everyone was calling, my friends were calling. Nobody knew where I was, and he knew where I was all along. It was the whole thing was a ruse, but it's in the intimate partner violence red flag land. That is one of the most alarming signs that something is about to happen. And this was a week before the event did happen that narrowly escaped from.
Mhm. And I don't necessarily want to give too much away because I really want people to like buy this book, but something happened and your husband essentially said that your oldest son needed to like be a man and I'm not going to say because it's a
Mhm.
lot and people should read the book, but what I wrote down after reading that and how like he got foisted into manhood way too early. I said, Christian nationalism and fundamentalism doesn't just have an effect on women, right? There is also an effect on boys, and realizing that not only are women broken by this, but so are men. And he was like 12 years old at the time and expected to be a man already and resentful about having to be a man. And especially it seems that kind of man,
Yeah.
like I just want I was so sad at that part for your oldest son because like his, he's a child. And at that moment too, he's like, well, this is what it is to be a man in this church. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And for you as a mother to have to deal with that. How are your kids now?
They're so good. They're so good. I'm so grateful that that scene that you're referring to, and that whole like I don't know, maybe 48, 72-hour span, was such a defining moment of this is what's going to happen to your children. And that's why I opened the book with that scene. This is what's going to happen. You are going to, with the scene of me realizing this, of you're going to raise children who abuse people. You're going to raise girls who stay with their abusers. And that is on you because this is the example that you set for them. Um, I had to get out desperately, and it was very urgent. And it was, I spoil this all the time. I talked about it in Shiny Happy People. It was after a 4-hour hostage situation, and I left at midnight with just my life and my kids and my computer, a day's worth of laundry that was on the table. We narrowly escaped a murder suicide, and that whole window of time not only was like the last possible chance I had to leave, which was way too late. This is another reason why I wrote the book. So it would be a warning to people who would recognize that they are in similar waters. But also it was in the nick of time for my kids. So we got out, they were 12 and under, and I parented them different the second half, and they didn't turn into patriarchal fundamentalists. They're all sensitive, good people who give back to society. They're all functioning adults. They're engineers and artists and doctors, and I'm so proud of them.
You have absolutely every reason to be, and of yourself. I can't recommend this book enough. Okay, hold on just a minute. Let me, oh, okay.
Yeah.
So then after you make it out, I hope I get to meet you at some point, really, because I felt a kinship to you reading the pages of your book because, I also suffered from some trauma when I was a teenager from a family member, and it all came like spinning apart in my, I guess, early 40s because I was teaching at the time and counseling a girl who was the same age as I was when my abuse took place. And in counseling her and then having to be the mandated reporter to call DCS,
Wow.
I was like, I was outside of my body. And then suddenly this incident that happened that I knew about, it wasn't a suppressed memory. I've always known about it. I just thought it was my fault. Suddenly, in telling this little girl that what happened to her was not her fault, it was like a out of body experience. And I was like, and then I had to go and just scream into a pillow. And so like and things kept unraveling for me. I did talk therapy, I reached out to friends about it, all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't until I did EMDR. So talk a little bit about your EMDR journey. And then I think you brought up another form of therapy that I hadn't even heard of before.
Yeah, you're probably talking about brain spotting.
That's,
So,
yeah.
one of the things that I love about my experience is that when I got out in 2007, a lot of language still did not exist for the kinds of experiences that I had had, the modalities that I've used. There's certainly social media was just getting kicked off. And as I healed, those things became available. So what happened is that I have this inner tenacity that wanted to reclaim my life. It was not acceptable to me that that was going to be my entire life story, the only thing that happened to me, the only thing that I was about. And I recognized that I had some power now to say, to put a container on it and say, they took my past. It's not going to get my future. I'm the only one who can do something about that. So I pretty much, was game for anything that came out. Religious trauma was coined, and there started to be research in this area and therapists that were trained in it. Ex-evangelical hashtag came out. I was diagnosed with complex PTSD, which they are starting to recognize in people who not just the military, but you can get this from your relationships and the situations that you're in. And so having language and no more stigma about this, evolved at the same rate that I healed. And EMDR was one of those times. Like EMDR is fantastic if you have a complex trauma, and it helps you like create a new neuro pathway of response. Excuse me, that's a cat fight. I'm sorry, you can hear that. I don't know how to make
We
them
couldn't
stop.
hear it. You're fine.
You can't hear it?
We
Okay.
can't hear it.
Two cats are fighting in my office, and wow. Okay. Let me regroup.
It happens.
And oh my gosh, I'm so glad you can't hear it because that was truly terrifying. Um, okay. EMDR. EMDR helps rewire your response so that while you cannot go back in time and change how you reacted in the moment, you can change how you react to it in as you replay it in your mind. And we do. When we're traumatized, we replay situations in our minds over and over again. And so you create a new neural pathway through EMDR. Brain spotting is like taking EMDR and pushing fast forward. You end up doing a whole bunch of memories at once because it just kind of flips through like a Rolodex, and then where it's stored in your mind, and then whatever the main one is, it latches on, and you kind of rewire that one. So I found it to be extremely freeing. I didn't have to keep rehearsing the same response or feeling shame over my response anymore because I was able to see things from a different perspective.
Mhm. Yeah, I thought it was a bunch of hocus pocus phony baloney, and and I was like, well, talk therapy's not working, so I might as well try
Yeah.
it. And it was an absolute game changer for me. So
Mm.
where are you at right now with your spirituality? If you don't mind
Yes.
me asking.
No, yeah, everyone asks me that. And I have a good long answer for it. So I am a spiritual person. I'm not a religious person. I don't think I'll ever need a congregation again. But how I answer the question of like, are you still a Christian? Is that I'm spiritually private. I think that as a young child, I should have had more privacy and autonomy and exploration time to decide what my life beliefs would be. One of the things evangelicals do is they put a lot of pressure on 4 and 5-year-olds to pray and accept Jesus into their heart, and they are going to make a decision for the rest of their lives what they're going to believe. And so I give myself the gift of privacy when I have that question. I think spirituality is very fluid, and if you're going to resist fundamentalism in your life, you need to allow it to stay fluid. I'm a little people pleaser. I still am in recovery, so I'm always aware that part of me is like, I really want to give them the answer they want to hear. And the secular people want to hear that I'm an atheist, then the Christians want to hear that I'm still some kind of Christian, and I cannot get involved in people pleasing. So I say tap out. I'm spiritually private, and that gives me a boundary, just a healthy boundary to say I will explore it on my own and let it grow and be fluid. And people can suss out my character as they know me. They can decide for themselves if my work is valuable or not. We use those labels to signal safety and ideological safety. And so I think it's really essential with the kind of work that I do that I not alienate any group with an answer like that.
Fair, fair. I respect that. I so you Alan made you stop being friends with your friend Michael, who is a man, but
Mhm.
also a gay man, and he said you couldn't have any relationships with any men, even gay men. Are you guys
Mhm.
friends again? Are you friends again? Have you
Yeah, he's my best buddy. Yeah.
oh
Yeah.
good. I'm
He's
so
been,
so
yeah.
I'm so happy to hear that because like I've heard stories from a lot of women mostly, but even just people about having to discard like family
Mhm.
members, relationships, etc., because of their, significant other, their parents' ideologies. So I'm really glad that you and Michael are friends again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's my family, my chosen family.
You know what? I think a lot of us, probably folks in this webinar right now, also have perhaps like me, more chosen family than actual family at this point in my life. And I wasn't even raised in religion, so I'm sure it's far worse for folks like you who were. So um I always end these discussions every Friday because we talk about some pretty heavy stuff here. So I like to end on a note of hope. So Tia Levings, in this day and age, and considering all that you've gone through and the fact that you're now seeing it played out in bright letters in front of us every single day, what
Mhm.
gives you hope?
People talking, connections, survivors. I think there's more of us who care than those who want to control. I think that if everyone shows up and votes, that we will win by landslides. I think that we believe there's more people who want a progressive society that values science and progress and technology and advancement than don't. Um, and I think that as long as we can have those freedoms, we should use them, and that people are beautiful. So I love diversity. And I love hearing, one of the things that happens with my book is so many people will approach me and say, I didn't grow up like that, but I grew up in a relatable enough way to where it was valuable to me. And that means everything to me. That's the plurality of a healthy society. And we can heal together that way.
Well, I'll tell you what, I have been telling everybody I come in contact with
Thank
about your book. I could not put it down. It is called A Well-Trained Wife. I'm sure you can, I know that Lindsay's already put up all the places you can find it, but
Thank you.
really support the work that Tia Levings is doing, because it's really important. And I feel like such a fangirl today. Seriously, I've been looking forward to this for months. So thank you so much for joining us today, Tia.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Have a wonderful Friday, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.